And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm Faran, and along with Kit, we seek to take our listeners on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope our warm conversational tone makes an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing the body in the process. This is our 45th episode in the Journey Through the Scripture series. We hope that you review prior episodes just to make sure that you have context for what we're jumping into. In light of what I just shared, one of the things that's really important today as we dig into the downfall of David's kingdom with the focus on the southern kingdom is to really understand its connection to the northern kingdom and its plight and what happened. And one of the things we're really going to dig into is a compare and contrast and the significance of the privilege that the southern kingdom had too, and why they received the judgment that they did, which led to their ultimate destruction. So please keep that context in mind as we jump in. Kid, with that in mind, I think one of the things that we really want to jump into is in what ways did Judah's greater privilege and exposure, which I've already alluded to God's truth intensify its guilt and judgment compared to Israel's, who was obviously under God's condemnation as well. And what does this reveal about divine expectation and accountability from God's perspective?
Well, I think the place to begin is with kind of defining that greater privilege that Judah had. And again, we have to kind of go back to some of the ground that we've covered to this point. We saw that the result of David's failure with Bathsheba, which we've discussed several times, I think it was a failure primarily at the level of covenant faithfulness and the obligation that David had as kind of the epitomizing Israelite, the king of Israel, the chosen son of God in that sense as the royal king. His obligation to set an example for the people of fulfilling that covenant obligation of bearing witness to the nations for the sake of God's blessing going to the nations. That was the Abrahamic calling. And so David's sin with Bathsheba resulted in God saying that a sword is going to come upon your house and it will never depart from your house. Well, we saw how that sword starts this cleaving, cutting, dividing process within David's own household with his children, his family, leading to one of his sons leading a coup against him, driving him away, and then that son ultimately dying. But what happens then is that this cleaving sword on David's house then moves beyond his family household to his kingdom house. And we saw how during the reign of Rehoboam, David's grandson, the son who acceded to the throne after Solomon, the kingdom itself was split. It was cut in two by the sword. And you now, from that point forward, have David's kingdom reduced to two tribes, his own tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. And the other 10 tribes are broken off and given to a man named Jeroboam the first, who becomes that first king of that 10 tribe sub-kingdom that becomes known as Israel. So from that point forward, you have David's kingdom reduced to two tribes, and you have a separate Israelite kingdom in the northern part of the land of Israel that is known as Israel. So as you read through the Kings and the Chronicles, those accounts, and really for the balance of Israel's history, there is this distinction within the Israelite people of the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And what we've done to this point is consider in kind of summary fashion the history of the northern kingdom and how it started at a point of idolatry and unfaithfulness under Jeroboam, and it was just a couple hundred years of unfaithful kings, finally culminating with Israel's destruction at the hand of the Assyrians. And so that northern kingdom is no more. It went away around 721, 722 BC, with the people scattered, nothing left of those 10 tribes in the land of Israel, all destroyed, taken away. Well, God gave a lease on life, as it were, to what was left of David's kingdom in the south, just these two tribes of Judah and Benjamin under the name of Judah, with the capital at Jerusalem. So that southern kingdom then endured for about another 140 years, roughly. And that's what we're kind of getting at today, is that you had from about 925, 930 BC to the destruction of the northern kingdom 200 years later, you had the parallel track of these two, sub-kingdoms of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they're interacting with one another, sometimes in a hostile fashion, sometimes in an alliance fashion. Sometimes there's peace between them, sometimes there's hostility between them as the generations go along. But they are nonetheless Israelite people in the same land, having some sort of connection with one another. So the point is that David's kingdom, what remains of it, those two tribes, the kingdom of Judah, sees what's happening in the north. They're very well aware of the progress of the northern kingdom, and even the unbelief and idolatry of the northern kingdom affects and infects the southern kingdom through different alliances and that sort of thing. So, but Judah watches what happens, what God does with Israel in the north, and yet they don't learn from that. So their greater privilege was the fact that they remained the remnant of David's kingdom. They retained Jerusalem as the capital. The temple was in Jerusalem. That was the place of encounter. That was the place where the covenant kingdom promised to Abraham, and that had been David's kingdom, that was the place where what was left of David's kingdom was still intact, and the worship of God could take place at the temple in Jerusalem. And so they had a greater covenantal privilege and a greater spiritual privilege as well, compared with their brothers and sisters in the north. And yet, at the same time, and even when Israel in the north was destroyed, they were given, as I say, this lease on life, another century and a half to continue on. And yet through all of that, they proved to be just as unfaithful, and actually ultimately worse. If our listeners are familiar with Ezekiel's prophecy, he was a priest who was taken as an exile early on before Jerusalem and the southern kingdom was finally destroyed. But he's given this prophecy from God concerning two sisters, Oholah and Oholibah. This is chapter 23 of Ezekiel. And there God, through this kind of parable story, talks about these two sisters. The older one, Oholah, is Israel in the north with Samaria as the capital. Oholibah is Judah in the south with Jerusalem as the capital. And he talks about how they were both unfaithful, but Oholah was started down this path. And even though Oholah was dealt with severely by God, Oholibah didn't learn from that. And she became worse, and she followed the patterns of her sister, becoming more guilty because she had the privilege, because she even got to see what happened to her older sister. It's like somebody who watches a family member who dies of heroin addiction or something, and doesn't learn from that and follows down that same path. There's a greater culpability, a greater guilt on that other person, because he got to see the effects of this real time, and yet he didn't learn from that. And that's the guilt that comes upon the southern kingdom. And they will eventually go down that same path, as we're going to see. They will end up in the same place, which means conquest, desolation, death, exile, captivity. And so by the time this is done, there will be nothing left of the house of Israel, nothing left of David's kingdom. All 12 tribes will be will be slaughtered, destroyed, in exile. But that was the privilege that the southern kingdom had. And so their guilt was much more severe, and God dealt with them much more harshly. He expected them to learn and to be faithful because of that, both their privilege and also just the example that they had in Israel in the north.
Absolutely. Building on that, Kit, how does the repeated cycle of reform and relapse across Judah's kings, Asa and Ahaz, illustrate the struggle between personal piety and systemic corruption and sustaining covenant faithfulness, which I think you've already spoken to a little bit?
Well, you do see one contrast or a distinction between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Israel in the north began on a wrong foot with Jeroboam, and we've discussed, him building altars and building images and establishing a new priesthood and a new place and system of worship for the people under his kingship in the north, the people of Israel. And that pattern, that sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, continued on throughout the 200-year life of the northern kingdom. And so it pretty much was on a trajectory of getting worse and worse and worse. Whereas in the south, the remnant of David's kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, it was kind of an up and down thing. You had some kings that were better, some kings that were worse. There were kings that essentially, through their connections with their brothers in the north, through marriage, family relation, alliances, whatever, they, as I said, that kind of infection from the idolatry of the north got into the veins of the kings, and it affected the southern kingdom under some kings and under the rules of some kings. So there were times when Judah, throughout its history, was really bad, and there were times then when a king, and this was all the line of the kings, the sons of David, that were ruling in Judah, but some of them, for various reasons, were uh, reformers. They returned to the Lord. They restored the relationship. They tore down the images, the idols. But they never completely dealt with the problem of idolatry. They were a king. They were ruling a people, and this infection of idolatry, no king in Judah was able to fully stamp it out. And even though there were reforms of various types and kind of trying to bring things back together, this uncleanness that had worked its way into David's kingdom continued to exist. And so there was never the eradication of idolatry or the worship of idols, following after the gods of the Canaanites and the other nations around them. That was never eradicated completely throughout the southern kingdom. And this is very much what we see even in our own experience in the world. You can have a good leader, you can have a good president, or a good whatever politician in some sense, but the culture itself, no person, no individual, not even a group of people can themselves reform a culture. Ultimately, there's a trajectory in human culture, and it's always down, right? Empires
Right.
and nations
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the
Disintegration.
exactly,
Yep.
that's always present, and it's kind of out of the ruins, as it were, that something new is born. But this is the pattern that's always followed, and so it was true in Israel's case as well. Even the kings who sought to be faithful to Yahweh and the covenant and the definitions and prescriptions he put in place, they could never really recover that kingdom back fully. And eventually it just got worse and worse, and God dealt with it in the same way he dealt with Israel.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Kid, it even speaks to this idea that once these things become entrenched, Kid, too, that even if you do have an anomaly or someone pushes against it, it's literally almost like a fish swimming up against a massive torrent, a stream, Kid, too, is it was like
Right.
for a time it'll look like progress, only to essentially be overcome by just the torrent, right? That is that dominant culture too, as well. And I think that's what we saw, to your point, not only in the Northern Kingdom, but even more so, even with greater privilege, which was their indictment in the southern kingdom, they were waylaid by the same reality. Keep building on that. What do the intertwined royal alliances of Jehoshaphat's marriage alliance to Ahab's house reveal about the dangers of political pragmatism when it compromises spiritual integrity too, which may be a underlying theme that maybe some of our listeners didn't maybe quite pick up in the notes. Speak to that a little bit.
Well, we talked about Ahab before, and in the scriptures, he's given the most time, I believe, of most time textually
Right.
wise of any of the kings of Israel because he plays such an important role in the history of Israel. He's that king in Israel, meaning the northern kingdom of Israel, who was reigning at the time when God challenged Israel through Elijah with their moment of decision. If Yahweh's Lord, if he's God, serve him. If Baal is Lord, serve him. You can't hesitate between two positions. So Ahab is kind of at the pinnacle. He brings this idolatry to its apex in a certain sense in the history of Israel and is confronted, and the people under his rule are confronted with this is a decision. We either go forward in a repentant way and turn back to the Lord, or this is not going to go well. But what happens under Ahab also, Jehoshaphat is the king in Judah in the south, and they form an alliance for the sake of both their political security. Also, perhaps Jehoshaphat, and he was overall a good king, seeking peace with his brothers in the north. But it was a political alliance as well. And part of that alliance, which is very common in the history of the world, still happens today. That alliance was sealed through marriage, where the daughter of Ahab was given to Jehoshaphat's son. Well, now what you have, again, Ahab's wife Jezebel was not even an Israelite, she was a Sidonian, and her goal was to eradicate the knowledge of Yahweh in Israel in the north. So tearing down all of the things that are, the altars to Yahweh, and really kind of working hard to establish the worship of Sidonian gods, getting rid of the worship of God in Israel. Well, Jezebel's daughter, and Ahab and Jezebel's daughter is now given to the son of Jehoshaphat in marriage. Well, Athaliah, I believe was her name, she brings that same, she's her mother's daughter, and she brings that same dynamic into Judah. And whereas her mother, Jezebel, had sought to kind of remove the knowledge of Yahweh in Israel, what happened under Athaliah is that any kind of connection at all with Yahweh and his worship, even the not the tearing down of the temple, but the neglect of the temple. I mean, she took what her mother had started in the north and tried to also impose it and even enlarge it in the south. So that's the marital alliance that you're talking about, and it was formed for political reasons. So now you have, through marriage, the conjoining of the idolatrous kingdom of the north that is kind of epitomized in Ahab and Jezebel. And as I said, the text gives so much time to Ahab because of the wickedness, and he's like the notorious king among a whole litany of bad kings. He's the notorious king, and with his wife Jezebel in the north, and now that influence is woven into the southern kingdom, the remnant of David's kingdom, through this marriage. And Athaliah wreaks her own havoc in the south. She's that daughter that is given. So that's kind of the way in the biblical story, the Israel Judah story, of how this plays out. But I think we can see practical applications of this, or instances of this, not only at maybe a national level or a corporate level, corporate meaning a community level, but even at a personal level, where decisions that seem to be right because they're, as you say, pragmatic, they serve some good purpose, they seem to be beneficial, they seem to be helpful, but they're ultimately spiritually compromising. And so whatever we think is the benefit to be derived from certain alliances or certain decisions or certain whatever it happens to be, it can actually be an undoing. And I guess one quick example that comes to mind, I mean, over many years, I've heard several times people talking about Paul saying, I become all things to all men, that I might win them. To a Jew, I become as a Jew, as one under the law, though not under the law, but in law to Christ. That where he talks to the Corinthians and talks about this thing of meeting people where they are in order to meet them with the good news of what God has accomplished in Christ. And people will take that idea of becoming all things to all men and use it to justify pragmatic approaches to evangelism or ministry or whatever in the name of reaching people. I'm becoming all things to all men. And what they're really doing is they're compromising the distinction, the integrity, the fragrance of Christ for the sake of what they think is a good outcome. And that's
Pseudo
just one
gospel, right?
example. And
Yeah. The kind of a pseudo
yeah,
gospel is what you're speaking to, kid, right? Yeah. Mhm.
well, and that's what ends up happening because, and this goes beyond where we want to go today, but if the gospel is the good news of this new creation in Christ, then we embody in ourselves the gospel that we proclaim. And so if we are coming to people or encountering people in a way that isn't testifying to that new creation, that Christ likeness, that fragrance of Christ, then whatever gospel we think we're bringing to them, it's not the gospel. And so even if people respond favorably to what we say or what we present, as you say, they're responding to something that isn't even really the gospel. But that's just one example of a myriad of ways in which we can think that we know better than God, or we think that this pragmatic thing that is a natural way of thinking and ordering our decisions and our conduct and our actions, we think that this will be the way to achieve a good spiritual end, and it just doesn't work that way.
Switching gears a little bit, kid, too, how does the temple's condition at different points in Judah's history serve as both a literal and symbolic indicator of the nation's covenant relationship with Yahweh, too? And we want to make sure that we keep that at the backdrop of all this. All this is done within the context of a covenant relationship. So the privilege,
Right.
the indictment, the failure, we don't want our listeners to watch us to lose light of that, too, that all of this happens in the context of that established covenant relationship. Speak to that a little bit, kid.
Well, again, all of this takes us back to the garden and the human obligation of sonship, man as priest and king. But certainly with Abraham, and the Israelite people were the covenant people of Abraham, and that Abrahamic covenant obligation was that these were to be the people through whom the blessing of God would come to all the families of the earth. In other words, God took a people out and now defined and prescribed them to be his children, to, in a sense, manifest who he was by their faithfulness as sons and daughters, so that as they lived out that sonship faithfully on display, the world, the watching world, would come to know their God. And in that way, this was how the world would be gathered back to God. This is ultimately dealing with that estrangement of the human race and creational estrangement. This is the way God was going to end that, was through Abraham and his descendants. And so Israel's when we get bogged down in the history of Israel and Judah, and we say, oh, this guy was an idolater and this guy committed this murder, and that, we do see all the palace intrigue and all the political stuff and all of that you always see. But as you say, behind all of that is this fundamental failure of Israel, both the 10 tribes in the north and the remnant of David's kingdom in the south, the failure of the Israelite people, the Abrahamic covenant household, their failure to fulfill that covenant calling, to be a faithful people, to be son of God on display in the world. And the temple was at the center of that, because the temple was the place where God was present among his people, the place where they encountered him, the place where they worshiped him, the place where their devotion and their service kind of had its focal point. And so you see that as their hearts, and this pertains to the southern kingdom, because again, the Israelites in the north, the northern kingdom of Israel, they had no access to the temple. That was why they've even formed their own system of worship there, beginning with Jeroboam, and they didn't have the kind of open access to the temple that the southern kingdom of Judah did. But as the people's hearts and their attitudes wandered from the Lord, as they built other high places and other altars, and they began to seek out and worship other gods, well, obviously the temple and its ministration got neglected, because their attention's over here, their interest is over here. And so you saw it in both physical deterioration, the deterioration of the priesthood, the priestly ministration. And part of what happened when these good kings would arise in Judah, they would set about tearing down these other structures of worship throughout the land, altars, high places, that sort of thing, and refurbishing or rededicating, kind of redirecting their attention back to the temple, which obviously was a physical structure and needed to be maintained, and its priesthood and all of that. But symbolically, as you say, this was really the centerpiece of Israel's covenant faithfulness. So when the temple was in disrepair or neglected, or the people were, their hearts were elsewhere, that was the strongest indicator of their covenant and faithfulness. Israel was son of God, and it was to be utterly devoted to the Father, bearing his likeness, his fragrance on display in the world. And their hearts and their lives and their interests and their attitudes were elsewhere. And so they essentially forsook him in that physical manifestation that would just kind of was an outward expression of what was going on in their hearts. So seeing that up and down, even with the temple and its maintenance and its ministration throughout Judah's history, is kind of a focal point of a barometer, if you will, of the spiritual health of the people, or how they were in relation to the covenant relationship.
As we wrap up this study, one of the things that I think our listeners may be wondering is, in what ways does the progression from Asa's reforms to Ahaz's abominations demonstrate the cumulative nature of sin and erosion of covenant identity within Israel once consecrated to God? And I think that even speaks back to some of the things we just alluded to.
Well, I think we see just in the nature of human existence that the tendency is always downward. We talk about entropy as kind of a principle of physics, that we don't lose. There isn't a production or loss of energy in the greatest, in the ultimate sense.
Sure.
But there's a movement in which energy moves from usable forms to unusable forms. Entropy, so you burn a log, you get the energy out of it in light and heat. Well, that energy is still in the universe, but it's not recoverable. You can't get at it again. And so what I'm trying to get at is there's a kind of spiritual entropy or path that's always followed as well. And the Puritans used to talk about declension, spiritual declension. and how, kind of yielding yourself, giving a little way, a little space to unfaithfulness just leads to more unfaithfulness. It leads to more, leads to more, leads to more. And there's this decline that takes place, a kind of spiritual entropy that we see happen. And it happens obviously at the level of individual human beings, but it happens also at the community level, the family level, the national level, even the global level. And so there is kind of a process that you see. And we talked about it even with kingdoms and empires. They always move towards their ultimate disintegration and dissolution. And you certainly see that again in the life of the covenant household. It began with a promise to Abraham that he would become a great nation, that kings would come forth from him. He would make Abraham great. And Israel became a great people. Even when they came out of Egypt, they came out of Egypt in a kind of triumph, right? And now this process of greatness, a kind of regal, glorious status, reached its apex under David. And he established a kingdom in which he, through his son Solomon, ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the Mediterranean Sea to the river of Egypt, just as God had promised to Abraham. David ruled over all of those nations as well as the covenant house of Israel, and the nations brought him their tribute. That was the apex of the power and the significance of the Israelite kingdom. That was the fulfillment at kind of the natural level, the Israelite level. That was the fulfillment of that promise to Abraham. But that high point that was reached in David didn't endure. David, as we talked about, that Bathsheba episode was the turning point. And God says the sword is coming on your house and it's not going to depart. And so now you have this starting of a downward process. And that's what we've been tracking from David forward in his own family circumstances, and then the dividing of the kingdom, and then the path of the two kingdoms. All of this is the outworking of that decline. But behind all of that, and this is the most important thing to emphasize, and we will keep emphasizing this, behind all of that decline and disintegration and unfaithfulness and judgment, and ultimately the total destruction of David's house and throne and kingdom, is this promise of God to David that I will establish your house and your throne and your kingdom forever in a son to come from you. So even while everything's going away, and God is being faithful to the truth, to his righteousness, in judging this people who have abandoned him, who will not be faithful, who will not fulfill their covenant sonship, God is dealing with that justly. But behind all of that is his faithfulness to his intent for the world and ultimately for his creation that he bound up in Abraham. He will be faithful to Abraham. He will be faithful to David. He will see to it that these things that he has intended for the world, that he bound up in Abraham and his descendants, that those things will be realized. So even when we see everything go away, that's not the end of the story. And it will leave the Israelite people in their scatteredness, and even the remnant back in the land of Judea, it will leave them in a place of waiting and longing. The better part of 6 centuries, they will be waiting, they will be longing, they will be hoping, they will be trusting. And Israel's faith in their God will be precisely that he will yet somehow, in a way we can't understand, but he will somehow arise and he will fulfill what he has promised to Abraham, what he has promised to David. They had a hope of a coming restoration of David's house and throne and kingdom in a son to come from David. And this becomes at the center of that messianic hope that Jesus is born into.
And kid, like I think to what you were saying, like I think the headline for us is similar to life out of death, which is a thing we've talked about quite a bit. We also see that there is life out of destruction, out of despair too,
Yep.
and that God's covenant promises endure in the midst of all these things too. And so our hope as well should be encouraged and steadfast, knowing too is that he fulfills all these things, even when on the surface, naturally, Kit, it looks like these things, to your point, have no chance of succeeding too, is because these are his covenant promises. They will come to fruition. So we should be encouraged as well. We sincerely hope that this time you've shared with us has been profitable. Kit and I are excited to build on this as we jump into our next episode. We'll talk more about that as well. But once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. And I always make a quick plug for our glossary, where we speak more in depth on a lot of these terms that have been referenced in the studies. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.